Now, one other thought here, and then I'm going to give you a guideline that I apply whenever I hear about these kinds of things. Because I think that there's an ambiguity here. Certainly there could be a mixture of the Holy Spirit and some other kind of silliness going on. I'm not saying that a person has to be all right in everything he does to be used by God. God uses a lot of goofballs, including yours truly. But when I go to Timothy, this would be 2 Timothy, which is a unique letter because it's the last one that Paul wrote. And so he's kind of laying out to his disciple Timothy the most important things he could say just before he dies. And that's why there's a sense of urgency about this letter. And what he says there in chapter 3 and chapter 4, as he's concluding his 4-chapter letter, he says, first, there's going to be trouble in the world. Realize this, that in the last days, difficult times will come. He starts out chapter 3 this way. Men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving. And there's this rogues gallery of vice that he describes will be characteristic of the times to come. And he is warning Timothy that that's going to happen. And he's going to have to be prepared as an individual and as somebody who has responsibility over the church to deal with that when it comes. But it doesn't stop there, because in chapter 4, he adds another element. Not just trouble in the world, but trouble in the church too. And here's what Paul says about that, beginning of chapter 4. The time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but wanting to have their ears tickled, they will accumulate for themselves teachers in accordance to their own desires, and will turn away their ears from the truth and will turn aside to myths. Do you notice what the emphasis is here? Paul says trouble in the church because people are turning away from sound doctrine. You know, it's not unusual for these kinds of so-called revivals to emphasize almost entirely the experience, and whatever doctrine kind of surfaces during these times turns out to be bad doctrine. Paul says they don't endure sound doctrine, but what do they want? They want to have their ears tickled. They want to find teachers that will be in accordance to their own desires. They'll turn their ways away from the truth and they'll turn aside to myths. And of course, this happens all the time. And Paul is telling Timothy, trouble in the world and trouble in the church. You, however, teach the truth, all that other stuff. Well, actually, you have these two descriptions of things that are ahead of him. And right in the middle, Paul has his antidote, which is my main lesson, if you will. The thing that I go by whenever I address these issues. He just adds 3 words to introduce a concept that you ought to memorize. And those 3 words are, you, Timothy, you, however, continue. You, however, continue in the things that you have learned and have become convinced of. In chapter 4 of his first letter to Timothy, he says he refers to Timothy who is constantly being nourished on the words of the sound doctrines which you have been following. In other words, what Timothy has to be concerned with is not what's going to happen in the future in any alleged new movements of the Spirit. When faced with trouble in the world and trouble in the church in the future, Paul's last words to Timothy aren't be spiritually sensitive and always be on the front line of everything the Spirit is doing. Be on the cutting edge so you can always be where the action is. No, Paul said you look to the past. You look to the things that I have taught you, the others have taught you, what you become convinced of, the foundational things, and you stick with that and follow that. Now, here's my application. When I face these kinds of things, I don't have to ask myself, do I have to get involved with it? Because I know the answer to the question. If I understand Paul's recommendations to Timothy here, my answer is no. I don't have to get involved with it. I don't have to take the risk. There's enough questionable things already with what I've heard about Todd Bentley to begin with. But secondly, I'm not going to grieve the Spirit because I have my hands filled with trying to fulfill the original marching orders, the things which were already delivered. And therefore, if you are obeying that which has already been delivered, if that's where your focus is, you can't quench the Spirit. To put it simply, new movements of the Spirit, so what? Forget about it. Let it go. Don't worry about it. Don't turn your eyes to the future, you turn them to the past, to that which has already been delivered. And that's where your protection will be. Continue in what has already been revealed. You can't grieve the Holy Spirit if you're faithful in this way. And that applies to the so-called Toronto blessing. That applies to Todd Bentley's Lakeland, Florida revival, and anything else you face. There are legitimate questions that can be raised, and I've raised some. But ultimately, you could just set it aside and say, I'm not going there. I'm not taking the chance. I'm going to stick with the old tried and true, and God, I guarantee, will be happy with that.